Well, welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight on your Monday. My name's Shannon James, and I'm the Campaigns and Advocacy Director with Montana Environmental Information Center. And we're here tonight to talk about nuclear energy, which a lot of people are placing hope in right now as a solution for the climate crisis. And I encourage you all to keep an open mind in tonight's discussion as our panelists dive into some of the risks and realities of the nuclear industry. And after the presentation tonight, we are going to open it up to audience Q&A. So if you do have any questions, Brady here is going to be handing around some note cards. Feel free to jot your question down, hand it in throughout the presentation, and we will definitely try to answer it as best as we can at the end. So our panelists tonight, we have Clint McCrae, who is a fourth generation rancher south of Colstrip, Nick Fitzmaurice, MEIC's Energy Transition Engineer, and Crystal Tubols, who is the Executive Director with Honor the Earth. And before I hand it off to them to talk about nuclear and what's happening in Montana, I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about what's happening at the federal level. Right now, the federal government is working to create what they're calling a nuclear renaissance, and they're trying to rapidly expedite nuclear development in the U.S. And a lot of people are super concerned about safety, transparency, and regulatory independence in that process. Just a quick bit of history of how nuclear is regulated in the U.S. In 1975, Congress established the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, to be the independent agency in charge of safety and commercial licensing of nuclear reactors. And then a few years later, they established the Department of Energy, or the DOE, to be the promoter of nuclear development technology. And this was done intentionally to avoid conflict of interest between who is promoting nuclear energy and who's in charge of public health and safety. Then fast forward nearly 50 years later, Congress just passed the ADVANCE Act, which directs the NRC to streamline its licensing process and revise its mission statement to deprioritize safety and prioritize industry development. Then the following year, in comes Trump. And last May, he signed 4 executive orders around nuclear energy, one of which kind of reiterates what's in the ADVANCE Act as far as directing NRC to mandate expedited approvals of new reactors. And it also calls for major staffing cuts at the NRC and directs them to reevaluate their radiation safety standards. The orders are also transferring a lot of the authority away from the NRC into the DOE and the Department of Defense. And with that, the order also is directing Secretary of Energy at the DOE to approve 3 new reactor designs that are fully operational by 4th of July this year. So with this unreasonable timeline, the DOE gets straight to work and launches their reactor pilot program. And so part of this reactor pilot program, in order to get these designs that have ever been just concepts on paper off the ground and running in a year's time, they are rapidly working to rewrite their safety standards. NPR just released an article that showed that the DOE has cut nearly 750 pages of their nuclear rules, leaving about 1/3 of the original documents intact. Some of the most troubling changes we saw in those rule changes were the elimination of the ALARA principle, or the as low as reasonably achievable, which directs nuclear operators to keep radiation exposure levels below the legal limit whenever they can. So that's gone now. Some of the other changes were loosening of groundwater rules, taking strict language out and replacing it with vague language like you must consider protecting groundwater resources from radiation waste contaminating our groundwater. Same goes with a lot of our environmental protections that have been fully stripped in these rule changes. It's also worth noting that all of this was done without public knowledge and no public participation opportunity. But thankfully, there are a few opportunities right now for public participation of some of these federal changes. One of which is the DOE recently announced that they are proposing to exempt new advanced reactors from review under the National Environmental Policy Act. So basically, these new reactor designs will be approved without proper environmental analysis or any meaningful public participation opportunity. So there is a common opportunity right now for that. It's open until March 4th. And MEIC is going to have an action up on our webpage, hopefully by end of tomorrow, that'll give you the guidelines of how to submit the comments on that. Another common opportunity that's forthcoming is going to be on NRC's changes to their radiation rules. We think that that'll be coming out at the end of April, and there will be a 30-day comment period, so stay tuned for that. But this is a lot of doom and gloom. I'm mostly just trying to set the scene so you keep in mind some of the federal deregulation that's happening right now on a really fast level, while many states are looking to consider nuclear development, including Montana, which our panelists are going to dive into tonight. So with that, I'll hand it off to Clint.
Good evening. My name is Clint McCrae. I live south of Colstrip. My family has ranched on the Rosebud for quite some time. Rosebud Creek. The eastern edge of our place runs on Tongue River. Been involved with these issues, natural resource issues, for quite some time. Not because of a choice, but because I had to. But I want to talk about one thing tonight, and that one word, and that is accountability. If you've never been to Colstrip, I want to talk about some things that have happened down there from a rancher standpoint. Colstrip is obviously, and I think arguably, the youngest town in the state of Montana. It didn't get started until the 1920s when they mined coal to ship to the center of the country for steam locomotives. And that was just that way for quite some time until the 60s. Another mine, Western Energy coal mine, had been there for quite some time, Foley Brothers before that, and then the Peabody coal mine on Miller Coulee started in the 70s. One of the things that we realized early on is water issues. I need to say that water is the most valuable resource that we have in agriculture. And I don't care if you go from Broadus, Montana to Yak, Montana, and everywhere in between. If you see an old ranch, the reason that ranch is still there is because they had water. Any place you have a homestead in the teens that isn't there anymore, they didn't make it because there wasn't water. So it's the most valuable resource we have. The issue with Colstrip is on our place we've got 16 springs. Every one of them comes out of a coal seam. And the reason that water is in that coal seam is it's the most porous layer down there. So that's a very, very good value. For an arid area like Montana, people like my family have been there because of those shallow aquifers. It doesn't take much to pump water. In the early 60s and 70s, we realized that there were negative impacts of water adjacent to these coal mines. And there was a push on the national level and also the state level to pass meaningful reclamation laws. And it was quite a battle, but those laws were passed. And it's my opinion that since those laws did pass, that agriculture and mining could exist together. I will say, and I'm going to be critical tonight, but I will say I'll give the mines credit on their surface reclamation. They've done a pretty good job with Colstrip on the surface reclamation. The water is another deal, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about that tonight. One of the photographs behind me, this is of Miller Coulee. This was a homestead that my great-granddad had, and he picked that homestead because of the water in Miller Coulee. And you can see the ash trees and the cottonwood trees. This was a branding that took place in 1933. That spot was mined in the 70s and reclaimed, and when the water came back, cattle started dying from drinking the water. And when they tested the water, it was 30 times the lethal limit for sulfates. And so we called the DEQ. The DEQ was notified, and their solution to the problem was to fence the water off. In order to get their bond back for hydrologic balance, they needed to reach hydrologic balance, and we did not feel that killing cattle at 30 times sulfate level was not the hydrologic balance. And I'm not sure Peabody got their bond back because of this or they walked away from it, but it's an issue. The mine tried to change the law during that time to take the responsibility away from that hydrologic balance, and I went to Helen and testified on it. And when I got done, the representative of the DEQ and the Peabody coal mine rep was there, and he made the comment in that hearing that that water never was any good anyway. They had pre-bind baseline that they were supposed to do that they had somewhere, and they said they couldn't find it. But I made the point that those trees would not be there if the water was lousy. So that was a kind of a precursor of what to come. To this day, that water in Miller Coulee is not fit to drink. We had to build a pipeline and bring water in from other places. Another issue about water. When the 4 power plants were constructed in Colstrip in the 70s and 80s, Montana Power chose to do coal ash slurry out to these ponds to settle the ash, and then they could reuse the water back at the power plants. The landowners raised the issue that since these aquifers are shallow, these things had to be sealed. And the Board of Health, who was the precursor to the DEQ at the time, agreed. And they drafted what they called the 12D stipulation, which said that those ponds, 3 different ponds in 2 different watersheds, had to be completely sealed, a zero discharge facility, and a closed loop system. Pretty clear. We find out in the late 90s and early 2000s that these ponds were leaking when the landowner saw a reservoir filling with water in August. So the groundwater, the water that had leaked out of those ponds was becoming surface water. The DEQ estimated that these ponds were leaking 400,000 gallons of water a day. The plume of contamination around these ponds, 3 and 4 ponds, what I'm talking about, was finally about a mile radius. Their monitoring wells became pump back wells, and they kept drilling wells to find out what the plume, how big the plume was, until they drilled about 1,000 wells. This is a violation of their permit, and not one time did the DEQ lever a fine or write them up, and we felt that this was wrong. We trusted those companies to abide by the law and the state and the federal agencies to enforce it, and it was not done. Coal bed methane development, when it blew up in the 90s, we're pumping massive volumes of water out of the ground and dumping it down the coulee. We had to file a lawsuit against the DNRC to protect our water rights. First in time, first in right. Some of these went back to the 1880s. And the DNRC, their answer to the problem is they created a third category of water called produced water and blew us out of the water. We didn't have any recourse, which that isn't right. This is supposed to be a regulating agency and representing the best interests of agriculture and the public, and that was not done. As far as this nuclear facility in Colstrip, as you may or may not know, there was a private landowner that sold 10 square miles to Northwest Energy for a nuclear facility, AI facility, or a data center. We're not quite sure. But one of the reasons that I'm concerned about this is, again, water. Where are they going to get the water? It takes water. Where are they going to get it? And they have said, well, we don't need nearly as much water as you think we need, but they're going to need water. AI needs water. Data centers need water. Where are they going to get it? The state of Montana has over-allocated their water. They're not making any more. So in order for them to get their water somewhere, they're going to have to take it from somebody. Who are they going to take it from? Ag? Yeah. So last week or so, we met with the Rosebud County commissioners, and they said something that kind of scared me. They said, well, we've got this water from a water line that leaves the Yellowstone River and goes to Forsyth, and goes to Colstrip for the power plants. He said, that's the water they're going to use. And I thought to myself, do those workers, I'm going to have to get a drink of water. Do those workers at Colstrip know that? If they take that water, and does that mean that power plants are going to shut down? Does that mean these miners are going to be out of work? Do they know that? They can't do that. But it's a concern Because in order to do that, they're going to have to change the law. I don't think that you can have an industrial water right that goes from one to another. So it's a big red flag, and it's a concern. Hazardous waste is another situation. They say, oh, it's not nearly as bad as it was, but the law says that they have to bury that hazardous waste on site. To bring this back to accountability, if we are looking at the DEQ to regulate this hazardous waste, which would be their responsibility, and they can't even keep ash pond water in an ash pond, why the hell are we even looking at hazardous waste situation when they can't even keep water in a pond? That's a concern. The second thing is somebody would say, well, McCrae, you live 20 miles south of Colstrip, this doesn't impact you. If they change water law, every water rights holder in the state will be impacted by it. It would impact me. So that is a big red flag. This radioactive waste is nasty, it's lethal, it's forever. They're burying it in concrete casks and say that's good enough. I can't even keep a concrete septic tank from leaking in my house. How are they going to keep radioactive waste from leaking out into the ground? The problem is no accountability by the agencies, and we haven't heard anything from these companies as far as Q&A. They are meeting, we know, with county commissioners and decision makers, but have they met with the public? They've had dog and pony shows, but they have not answered the questions that they need to answer, and that is an issue. That's a problem. So what do? We get involved. We ask questions. I married a coal miner's daughter. I'm not anti-coal. And these people in Colstrip are friends of mine, and we've had our differences. The companies mainly that they work for. I don't want to see these guys lose their job. But if it's going to come down to those people losing their jobs and nuclear coming in, I don't think that's a fair trade-off. There's a lot better that we can do, and I think all of us need to step up and start asking these questions. County commissioners, economic development boards, county conservation districts, they handle the local water, city councils, our legislators who Montana had a law, I think passed in 1978, that said if there's a nuclear facility going into a town, that the people in that town or that community needed to sign off on it. They eliminated that law in 2021. Why did they do that? Look at the names on that who voted for it and who carried it. They knew this was coming, and that isn't right. I want to be very clear. I'm critical, and I have a reason to be. But all I'm asking for as a rancher is to keep the status quo. I don't want to lose water quality. I don't want to lose water volume. I want to be a part of that community like we've always been. But if these agencies don't enforce the law, that's going to go away. And that is wrong. And that's where the public comes into this. So, I'm glad you came tonight. I think this is going to be an interesting panel. I think we're going to have a question and answer session afterwards, so we'll be around for that. But thank you for your time and attention.
Great. So we've heard some good context of what's going on federally in the context of making sure that we have safety and regulations in place around nuclear, as well as some really good context of what's going on, kind of some history building on Colstrip and where that leads us now. Like Shannon mentioned, I'm Nick Fitzmaurice. I'm the Energy Transition Engineer with Montana Environmental Information Center. Spent a lot of time working on all sorts of energy issues around Montana. That takes us to the legislature, takes us to the Public Service Commission when Northwestern Energy is making different decisions. And a lot of that is to the end of trying to figure out how to decarbonize the energy system in Montana for a carbon-free and safer climate future, which gets a little more nuanced and complicated when we get into talking about nuclear, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But at the end of the day, we're really trying to find the cleanest and most cost-effective energy sources available to us, and I think as we'll find, nuclear actually doesn't check those boxes. But just a little more context building around what the legislation and kind of political landscape around nuclear is in Montana. we did hear briefly referenced, we had for many years in Montana a citizen referendum. It was passed on a ballot in 1978, where 65% of voters said, if we're going to build any kind of nuclear facility in Montana, we want that to come back before us for a vote. Like we have to approve that as a citizenry. And that stood for a number of decades until in 2021, the legislature repealed that. So this was something that was voted in by the citizens of Montana and then given up by the legislature without reconsulting the citizens directly. So that is what gets us into the situation we're in today, where there are these conversations around developing nuclear energy in Montana. And then fast forward to this recent legislative session that was in 2025, we started seeing some more bills moving through to pave the way for potential nuclear energy development in Montana. And that specifically was House Bill 623 and House Bill 696, which were giving legislative authority for the development of these kinds of facilities. So the first was legislative approval for siting nuclear waste storage facilities in Montana. And important context there is that there's actually nowhere in the United States where we have identified a way to permanently store nuclear waste. So this is short-term storage where if nuclear waste were generated in Montana, it would be put in casks and rated for 100 years, give or take, of storage, and then we'll figure it out. That's kind of what all the nuclear waste storage that we have today consists of. And we kind of opened the door and said, great, we can do that. Let's go ahead and allow it. And the other one was allowing for uranium processing facilities. And we're going to hear a little more about some of the supply chain and kind of comprehensive impacts of uranium life cycle development, mining, and especially those impacts to indigenous communities. But I just wanted to highlight that context. This here is Representative Shelley Fine on the House floor during the session, who tried to make some amendments to these bills that would require local consultation and approval from counties and proximate tribes that would be impacted by these facilities. Unfortunately, those amendments did not make it onto either of these bills, so we have now legislative authority and approval to develop these kinds of facilities in Montana. And that's what brings us here now. And then moving along, I wanted to talk, I mentioned that we're interested in clean and affordable energy for Montana. And I'm really going to focus on the affordable piece of that. I think there's a lot of aspects of clean that we'll hopefully hear more about, but specifically I wanted to highlight that nuclear energy remains the most expensive form of power available to us, and that there's other options. So a little bit of context here. In the United States, we, despite a lot of media attention and publicity around nuclear energy and a so-called renaissance, we've actually only built 2 different nuclear power plants have come online in the United States in the last 30 years. We had the Vogtle units 3 and 4 came online in the last couple of years at just about $37 billion. That's the most expensive power plant that has ever been built. That was plagued by delays, cost overruns. It originally was supposed to cost $14 billion and was supposed to be completed 7 years sooner than it was. And then the other one is Watts Bar Plant in, I believe, Tennessee. Was started construction in 1973, was stopped in the 80s, and then resumed in the early 2000s, came on in 2016. So amid all the media presence that you might hear about nuclear power, we've really only had a couple plants added at really high costs and really tremendous construction timelines. So if we're looking at, especially if we're looking for rapid development of clean energy, there's no proof that we can bring any of these plants online in a timeline that's actually going to decarbonize our energy system and meet the needs that we have today, nor that they will be affordable. And then I wanted to touch briefly on small modular reactors, which are kind of these ideas that have been discussed as this is how we're going to solve the problem, but we've still not seen any small modular reactor complete construction. The one outfit, NuScale, that had a design licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, their project a few years ago was going over budget and eventually canceled. And to this day, there's still a lot of folks in this game trying to build these expensive plants, but none have really reached the point of providing power to us when we need it. So we're still hearing a lot about them, but not getting the proof that they can provide any sort of value to us or at a good cost. And just to get a little more into some numbers, because I think about numbers a lot, just wanted to say, what does this mean for actual amount of energy delivered? So a megawatt is a unit of power, a megawatt hour is an amount of power delivered in an hour. Without getting too into the details, we can kind of compare what it costs to generate some amount of energy from nuclear power, and it's really expensive. And we can tell it's expensive when you look at kind of the standard Lazard levelized cost of energy analyses that show kind of the range of cost for energy for developments that are on the system in the United States. And if you compare utility scale solar, utility scale wind development, we see that even the more expensive projects on the high end of these ranges are still landing far below the cost of nuclear power that's come online in the US in recent years. And if you add storage to get some more of that firm and more kind of reliable grid services that you might want out of this kind of facility, you still see that you can do these projects cost effectively, get clean power without a lot of the repercussions at a much lower cost, while we're trying to create an energy system that's not going to keep driving rate increase after rate increase for customers. And this is the part of the story that we don't hear about as often. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of, and I'll touch on this, we want to create a new energy system and move into a system that does not contribute to a warming climate. And some folks think that, well, we just need nuclear for that. And the short answer is that we really just don't. And I want to get into it a little bit, just from, I guess I do have more numbers, but just some scale of what we're actually able to build in other kinds of energy versus nuclear. So, like I mentioned, we have these two plants that have come online, and those total about 3 gigawatts of power in the last 30 years that's come online for nuclear generation in the United States. And it's all about kind of relative numbers here. And then you look at wind and solar and battery power development in the United States in 2024, 52 gigawatts came online in the United States. This is power that is ready to build, it's really quick to build, and it's not this theorized thing, it's something that is going online rapidly, and is ready to serve the need that we have, and with the battery technology that we have today, is just really vastly superior to some theorized nuclear future. And we still don't have full numbers for 2025, but despite any kind of like the news trends you might see, and there is a lot of headwinds to some of this development, it's still, the economics are playing out that it just makes sense to build a lot of wind and solar and batteries because it is reliable, it is affordable power that we can get onto the grid really rapidly. And that's something that I think needs to be talked about more. And just for reference, so this is, say, 50 gigawatts in the United States online in 1 year. Northwestern's average load is less than 1 gigawatt. So if we get 1/50th of that slice in 1 year, then we're just about there in the amount of clean power we need for our system. And there's a lot more nuance to that, but there has been studies specifically looking at how to replace power output from the Colstrip facility and how we can do that cost effectively with wind, solar, and storage technology. And Montana is just really a high potential state for wind and even solar generation, because we do actually have a lot of solar here. And that's by analyses by the National Renewable Energy Lab. And lastly, I won't get into this, but we have been watching really promising developments for geothermal energy, especially down in Utah, folks bringing on projects that are really showing promising opportunities to bring low-cost geothermal power and good-paying jobs and opportunities in that. So we're going to be keep continue watching that as another part of this conversation. And then just for another presentation of those numbers, on the left we have the amount of nuclear energy that's come online in the last 30 years in the US, and then the amount of wind, solar, and batteries that came online in 1 year in the United States. And then just because I was curious, I looked at what China brought online in 2024, and it really just completely pales the rest of this. There's a lot of other options, and wind and solar and batteries really can do a lot for us. And I wanted to touch briefly on Northwestern's Integrated Resource Plan without hopefully getting too into it, but Northwestern has developed its 20-year plan. As with the last one, they're wanting to build, they're looking at nuclear energy to replace Colstrip sometime into the future. This is their 20-year plan that comes together they kind of iterate it every few years. And they had some meetings recently. There's still opportunities to comment on this plan to Northwestern, and that process is going to be ongoing. But essentially, it's charting a path towards more expensive investments and towards a nuclear future, because that's what's going to generate the most profit for that company. And more on that IRP. They ran a bunch of different scenarios. At the end of the day, it's really a model that gives an output based on how it's set up and what the inputs Northwestern provides for it. And they showed that in 15 of 18 of the scenarios they ran, they were going to build nuclear in some amount. With the small modular reactors that, like I mentioned, there's not actually any of those built to date, and they're just saying that they'll figure it out at some point and we'll pay for it. There's a lot of ways they assumed costs that weren't really fully reflective and didn't show what we would be paying. And I don't need to get into that too much, but there also wasn't really any discussion of what Northwestern planned to do with the waste, what implications there might be from the supply chain for uranium fuel, and a lot of other things. And meanwhile, they did a lot to undervalue wind and solar and storage, which we've seen everyone else is building really rapidly because they've seen that this is the most effective way to put power onto the grid. I think that might be, okay, this I think is my last slide. But yeah, like I mentioned, there's still opportunities to engage on Northwestern's IRP, specifically to that email or on Northwestern's website. And then come this spring, we'll be keeping folks informed on additional process at the Public Service Commission as when the final plan is submitted there. But I will now pass it to Crystal.
Good evening, everyone. First, I apologize. We were dealing with a loss in our organization, and so my notes are a little jumbled, but have all the information here. It just might take a second to get to those notes. But my name's Crystal Tubles. I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, so from southeastern Montana. I live in Colstrip. I reside there. I'm also pretty critical of nuclear and data centers, and I also have a partner who works as a coal miner as well. So I understand and definitely understand the need for the jobs and for that, and understand the structures and the systems that we live in. And also, you know, along with the rest, is not willing to sacrifice our water and our future and future generations in the name of short-term jobs, right? But really getting into it is like what brought me to this place is in Colstrip. It was about 2-3 years ago. There was some notices posted around Colstrip saying that there was going to be a nuclear feasibility study, right? And so a couple flyers here, there, and that was it. And then they had the meeting. I myself wasn't able to attend that initial meeting. But then a year later, back in May 2025, I actually was home, and there was another meeting, and this was about the results of the nuclear feasibility study. This feasibility study was hosted by GAIN. They're basically like a propaganda arm of the Nuclear Resource Council, right? And then it was also hosted by Northwestern Energy and Southeastern Montana Economic Development Corporation. And so those three entities had the nuclear feasibility study. To date, I don't know who they actually communicated with or who they actually spoke with, but they came back with the results of the feasibility study saying that there are absolutely no deterrents whatsoever in southeastern Montana for nuclear facilities or for nuclear enrichment facilities as well. And so that was a big red flag to me, especially considering that no one consulted with the Northern Cheyenne tribe, which is only about 15 miles away from Colstrip, 15, 20 miles or so, right? There was no consultation, there was no conversation. Even in the city itself, no one knew what was going on. It was just this random study result, and that was it. And what they told us, and the message was very clear, is that don't worry about it. This is like 10, 15 years down the road. You don't have to stress about it right now. And then, after research, come to find out, all of these data centers were attached to that, and actually they were moving a lot faster forward than we had thought, and that they had actually told us, right? And so very similar to Northwestern Energy's IRP plan, the 20-year plan that they put out in terms of the electricity in the state of Montana and what they plan to do for the next 20 years, they didn't consult anyone. They didn't have conversations. And in fact, in Northwestern Energy's IRP, I had to drive across the state of Montana. Everyone from this side of the state knows, you know, it's a long drive to get to Helena where all the decisions are made, right? So I drove 5 hours across the state to give a 3-minute public comment because Northwestern Energy, despite having big plans for eastern Montana, Billings onward, right, have no public comments or no public meetings over here on this side of the state. All of their public discussions were happening on the other side of the state. So I drove over there and I let them know that. So hopefully we'll get this in the future, but as of now, despite all the decisions impacting this side of the state, there's no public comments happening over here, and we are not allowed to have a say in what happens to the places that we live in and the communities we live in, which is a big concern, and very similar to how the feasibility study happened, right? So fast forward that a little bit, is I want to give a little overview of this connection. So a big part of my work this last year has been primarily on hyperscale data centers, right? So we all know that there's the proposed data centers. There's the one just right here north of Billings for Broadview. There's Butte, one other, and then I didn't get to read it yet, but I seen the Missoulian just now posted an article saying that there are now 11 data centers there's 11 data centers proposed for Montana now. And so all of these things are happening so fast without public consent, without transparency, without any kind of accountability, any conversations, right? These things are moving forward. But the big connection here is that these hyperscale data centers, they demand a lot of energy. They need a lot of electricity and energy and water just to keep functioning on a daily basis. But the reality is this is all in the name of generative AI. And there's actually no need for generative AI to keep existing. There's multiple different types of AI that exist out there, right? Some of it's used for accessibility issues, right? To have access for folks with different abilities, folks with disabilities. So you can use AI on different platforms. For example, you can use an AI app that reads a document to you, right? If your vision isn't the greatest, and that's great. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about generative AI and large language models that creates new content off of information that isn't even 100% accurate. So it analyzes all of the information that exists on the internet, right? It's already done that. It's already consumed everything that it possibly can. Its accuracy rate is only 60%. That means 40% of the content that we're getting from these things is not correct. And then it takes that information and it generates new information off of this misinformation. And that's a really dangerous place to be. The other thing that it's used for is surveillance. And it's also used to make the little pictures. I don't know if people are watching that. You want to see like 2-year-old you, or you want to see like how your mini-me looks, or you want a picture with Jason Momoa. That's what generative AI is doing on the back end, right? There's absolutely that's not necessary. That is not something that we need in our lives to continue to exist as people in this world. Water, on the other hand, is absolutely necessary, right? And so looking at this demand for generative AI, it's creating the demand for the hyperscale data centers. And that's what we're seeing is creating the demand for these nuclear power plants. So it's directly connected to these SMRs. There isn't actually an energy crisis right now. That is being made up. We're seeing that as we just now seen all the executive orders that are being rolled out. We're seeing the rollback of any kind of protections. So people who work in these places will no longer have the same level of protections and safety that they normally would being employed there. And we're seeing the lack of environmental impacts being taken into consideration. And now, for the first time ever, companies no longer have to take into consideration the impact on human lives anymore. And so we're seeing that all roll out right now to pave the way for these. And so really looking at these things, you have to also take into consideration the fact that all of this requires mining, right? More mining for critical minerals and critical resources. And so that means mining uranium, that means plutonium. That means we're going to have radioactive uranium coming through our highways in the state of Montana to get to Colstrip to be able to power that power plant if it were to go through, right? If anyone knows, I don't know who else lives on Highway 212, but Highway 212 is definitely known for all of the wrecks, all of the deaths, and everything that happens on there, right? We already have troubles with having a powerful infrastructure for our road systems as it is. Can you imagine now having semis going through on all of our interstates, all of our roads, hauling radioactive uranium to these enrichment facilities, right? We're already looking at that for other things that are going on. The other option is that we retrofit the railroad that exists there into Colstrip, right? Which is a lot of money to do so. And my guess is that they're not gonna wanna do that. So you have two options, radioactive material going through on a train, radioactive material going through on semis, on our roads, right? And to my knowledge, that's already happened with radioactive waste. I think folks older than me could probably say, but I think back in the day, because there are no long-term nuclear waste storage facilities in the world, not just the United States, not just Montana, but the world, what they used to do is they used to actually put them in semis and transport radioactive waste around the country and just drive it back and forth. Because there was nowhere to house it, right? And that's why states, and it's so dangerous now that we have legislation saying that we can now house radioactive nuclear waste on site. That is a very dangerous thing to do. All of that currently being proposed with Colstrip, Montana, right? And then that energy produced there will go directly to Broadview, Montana for the proposed data center that they're trying to build there and elsewhere, other places, right? So looking at these demands in the mining, where does that come from? I think it's important that we also name and recognize the impacts on rural lands and indigenous lands, right? It's like that's where these are gonna come from. And so what they're basically telling us right now, through the legislation, through these executive orders, and through the actions that these corporations are taking, is that they're willing to sacrifice the state of Montana. We will end up being a sacrifice zone, right? And I don't know if folks are familiar with the state of Oklahoma, but Oklahoma is very similar. I have employees that work down there and organize down there. They're facing off with the exact same things that we are here, and it's the same thing. But what they've come to find out is that they will actually take the waste, the discharged water that comes from powering nuclear plants and cooling them down, or even the data centers, and they turn around and they use them in agriculture and spray their crops with that. And that's now allowed because the state and a lot of decisions are being made to benefit industries, right? And so we have to think about that as like, a lot of us here, like we hunt, right? And we live off of the land, we use the sustenance lifestyle, and Montana's known for our open skies, we're known for the hunting, we're known for tourism, all of those things. What it does is it puts all of that at jeopardy. All of that will be at risk as we go forward. I was just down in Wyoming. We have relatives down there on the Wind River Reservation, but also Ethatee, Wyoming. In those communities, they had uranium enrichment and uranium milling facilities, right, to prepare the uranium to go in as fuel for the nuclear reactors. Right now, they have a 12-acre wide radioactive plume in their aquifer underneath. They have people, women, who have two different kinds of cancers in their bodies at the same time, two separate different kinds. They have entire families who have tested positive for different cancers, each of them different. So it's not genetic, right? They also, in their museum right there in Ethatee, have a two-headed calf. And they also have reports and stories about two-headed snakes. And that's just from the uranium enrichment and the uranium milling that happens, right? And so that's down there. You can actually go see these things. You can go check it out. It's actually still in the museum. But those are the things that I think about when I think about Montana being turned into that sacrifice zone, the way that they're moving. I think the biggest thing is obviously the health impacts, right? So we're looking at different kinds of cancer. And what I didn't know and recently found out was that radiation actually accumulates in your muscles very specifically. And so it's tied to very specific types of bone cancers as well. And I'm sure there's other folks that can speak more to it, but those are really scary things to think about. And then also just like the genetic mutation that happens when you're exposed to radiation itself, right? You literally change your genetics. And the scary part about all of this as well is just like the biggest impact is on newborns and babies in utero. And so they actually are exposed 10 to 60 times more to radiation and feel those impacts 10 to 60 times more than as adults. And so it'll be our children who pay that price eventually, right? Also just looking at like the impacts of water, we heard folks talk about the water very specifically. If folks know, Broadview has no water, and yet they're looking at like finding water somewhere and like piping that in, I guess. Coleship's the same way. I learned a new phrase the last time I talked with Clint around tank towns. And so really looking at all of these communities that don't have access to aquifers and to water, they're tank towns. They have to haul in their water. And so what we're hearing out of places like Georgia, Virginia, Louisiana, Texas, is that for those communities, whenever they encounter water issues, rather than prioritizing the civilians and the constituents that live in the communities and pay their taxes and pay for their water, they're actually prioritizing these hyperscale data centers, and they're prioritizing the nuclear power plants cooling over them, and they're telling them, well, you should take shorter showers, or you should limit the amount of time in the shower that you spend. And so they're putting restrictions on people who pay taxes and pay their water bills, and they're prioritizing the profit and the benefit of these corporations over them, right? And that's coming from folks who live currently next to these facilities, right? Whether it's nuclear or even a hyperscale data center. And so just looking at that, one quick fact around that is like water usage is power plants, nuclear power plants use 270 to 670 gallons per megawatt hour. That's it, per megawatt hour. So that many gallons of water, gone. Now contaminated, no longer able to be used for drinking, agriculture, ranch, any of that, right? And so that's a massive number. You can do the math with that. The other thing that I think about when it comes to the state of Montana, especially down on the Tongue River, is the fishing. And so water, once it's used for cooling on a nuclear power plant, right, is discharged. If they discharge that into our streams and our rivers, which they do and have done in other places, it actually raises the temperature of these rivers and raises the temperature of the streams and the creeks that we have. And that actually can have a devastating impact on the aquatic life there and the fish that people go fishing for, right? And so we're looking at these massive shifts that are going to happen in our lifetimes. These aren't things that'll happen, 100 years down the road or, when we're not here anymore. These are things that we will see in our lifetimes happen, right? The other thing to look at is like, where will all this contaminated water go? And so let's assume that they aren't going to just discharge it. Then where does it go? We just heard Clint share very specifically about the commitments that were made from the coal industry and what happened there, right? There's already been lawsuits. I don't drink water from the city of Colstrip. Even my animals, when I try to feed that to them, won't drink the water in Colstrip. I haul water in from the reservation because we still have access because of our class 1 air clean water policies that we have right now. We actually still have clean water that I can drink straight out of a spring, right? And so I haul water from there, but how much longer is that gonna last if we have a small modular reactor in Colstrip, right? It's going to impact all of these other places farther out. The other thing to think about really, again, is where this mining is going to happen from. And so for uranium mining very specifically, it comes from native lands. And so really making sure that we talk about that. There's over 520 abandoned uranium mines already on the Navajo reservation. The Navajo Nation is the only nation in the United States, native nation in the United States, to have their own epidemiology department because of the rates of cancer that exist, specifically connected to these uranium mines, right? And so we're moving ourselves in that direction the more that we go that way. We're also looking at Shoshone lands. They were bombed over 900 times to be test sites for nuclear bombs. And so their communities, there's entire families that have been pretty much obliterated because of the rates of cancer that are going through their community because of that testing, right? Just also mentioning the thermal pollution that I referenced earlier in terms of like the impacts on the fish population. There's already several different, I think there's 9 different nuclear reactors on the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest. And I think 7 of those, or 6 of those, actually discharge the warm water after they've cooled the nuclear reactor. They discharge that warm water into the Columbia River. And so they're already seeing the impacts on the salmon and the fish that they've worked so hard to revitalize now. And so we're already seeing those impacts in all of these other places. And right now in the state of Montana, like, we don't have that. We don't have to worry about those things right now, right? But we open the door to these, and we let one of these hyperscale data centers in, and we let one small modular reactor in, and it opens the door for massive, massive impacts that'll devastate us in, I mean, honestly, for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And so uranium, radioactive uranium, spent fuel coming off of a nuclear reactor has the light, like, it's still radioactive and harmful for hundreds of thousands of years. There's no one alive that can actually tell you that nuclear waste becomes non-reactive or safe. There's no one to say that. That doesn't exist right now. The other thing I want to point out with these small modular reactors that was already said by the folks that spoke before me, but just really wanted to lift it up, is that small modular reactors do not exist in real life. To date, there is no small modular reactor that we can actually go tour and go look at anywhere in the United States or anywhere in the world. There's rumors that one is in Russia and rumors that one is in China, right? But to date, there are no pictures, there's no evidence to say that. As of right now, small modular reactors only exist on a PowerPoint, on a presentation, right? And so basically what that means is if they want to bring small modular reactors into the state of Montana, they want to test it on us. They want to see if they can do this. That turns us into what they're calling sandboxes, right? They want to learn what the actual impacts will be. And we are the ones that will pay the price for it, both financially, socially, economically, health-wise, all of it, right? And so they're going to test on us what the small modular reactor can do. I also want to just point out and name, because I get into these conversations a lot, is the conversation around the Navy. Yes, Navy submarines are powered by small modular reactors, right? Like smaller nuclear reactors that exist on there. But you can't compare that to the demand that's going to be needed for a large-scale utility energy that's needed for these hyperscale data centers. This is a small submarine, a Navy ship, which has a very specific amount of numbers, which has the backing of the Department of Defense, and has unlimited resources to be able to fund that. And then you compare that to small modular reactors that have never been tested here in the United States and been operational here in the United States, that have to produce and provide for a hyperscale data center, and for Montana, Broadview specifically, 5,000 acre large hyperscale data center, which would be the largest hyperscale data center in the United States, right? Also noting with the data centers, just to keep that a part of the conversation, is that there's 5,400 hyperscale data centers in the United States. That is double the amount of all of the other countries combined. So why do we need more, right? There's actually not anything that necessitates that. There's no actual demand for that, right? And so just adding that, the last thing I'll say is just kind of like really building off of what Clint said when it comes to accountability. Is right now, our public officials are signing non-disclaimers, right? They're signing NDAs, and they're basically saying that they are not going to answer the questions to the public. They're not having public discussions here on this side of the state. They're not answering our questions. We've already tried to have meetings with county commissioners, right? We've already set those. We've tried to approach different people that are engaged in this. And the best response I think that we've gotten in terms of getting answers is like, well, you should sign up for the Energy Open that they have in Colstrip, and you can ask questions there. And for folks that know, the Energy Open in Colstrip costs money, and that's where all the industry leaders go, and they just have their good old boys club, play golf for the day. And so folks usually don't attend that, right? It's an inaccessible space. But yet that is the space that we're supposed to go to ask questions, versus going to their office, having a very specific meeting, asking them a question, and they can't answer me. And so to me, if leadership signs these non-disclaimers and they sign NDAs, they are no longer accountable to us. and we are the ones that voted them in. They should be at minimum answering our questions, at minimum having public forums and having these conversations, right? Because I know the answer is not black and white. I know that there's a lot of dynamics that go on here, and there's a lot of benefits, there's a lot of pros and cons to be had, but that conversation's not happening with the very people that are making these decisions for us, right? And that's the concerning piece for me. I will end with saying, in terms of like the jobs with the hyperscale data centers very specifically, is like I just read an article a couple days ago where Rapid City, South Dakota, which is connected to us because Northwestern Energy and Black Hills Energy are going to merge here pretty soon. They actually are pushing forward a hyperscale data center, and they published all of their statistics, and they said there's 3 full-time jobs. 3 full-time jobs after construction, right? So yes, construction jobs do exist. They are there for a short amount of time, and also at what cost, right? Once construction is completed, 3 jobs there. And so I would dare to guess that it's probably very similar with the nuclear industry, given that you have to have very specific certifications to handle this material and to be in those spaces. I imagine it's pretty similar. And so what are the real benefits for us here? What are the actual impacts? And like, why is no one answering our questions? Why is no one having public conversations with us about these things? And so I'll end with that. Thank you.
Alright, before we dive into the Q&A, I did want to mention a few engagement opportunities in Montana. As Nick mentioned, Northwestern Energy is going to be submitting their final integrated resource plan to the Public Service Commission at the end of April. And after that, there will be a public comment opportunity and I think 2 hearings on that. And then also, Yellowstone County Commissioners, Colstrip is their first stop, but nuclear is not only going to be proposed at Colstrip, especially given the fact that all these data centers are looking to Montana for power. And so these are going to be popping up in other locations, and I think that Quantica and Broadview could be one of those spots. So reach out to your county commissioners. Lastly, the Governor's Energy Task Force. Nuclear has been a hot topic in the task force discussion, especially to power data centers. They are having a couple open houses in the next few months. The framework of how these open houses are going to run is a little bit unclear, but they are an opportunity to show up and ask questions. So there's going to be one in Miles City on March 25th, and then there will be one in Colstrip on April 15th. And looks like they're TBD on the final details of location, but their website is right here if you want to check it out. And lastly, before we go to Q&A, I did want to thank all of our sponsors, including Billings Climate Coalition and Northern Plains Resource Council and Honor the Earth.